from an evolutionary perspective, is it plausible that our consciousness could emerge over time and become, more complex?
Yeah. Well, the funny thing is that atheists often assume this is the case without giving arguments to help demonstrate that. And the more that philosophers look at this, the more they just are flummoxed by it. And it's been called the hard problem of consciousness because it's really hard for atheists to explain it. It's not so hard for those who believe that God created us with a soul. But an example is that same philosopher I mentioned earlier who wrote the essay, What It's Like to Be a Bat. He later wrote a book called Mind and Cosmos, where he tried to analyze how can these different abilities of our minds have arisen if an atheistic evolutionary account of the world is true. And he ultimately said evolution doesn't explain this at all. He is still an atheist, but he's casting about for some way to have minds be something that's more fundamental in nature so that you don't need to build them from non-rational processes from the bottom up. And so he's sort of proposing radical new views within an atheistic perspective because he just doesn't want to believe in God. And yet he has no explanation ultimately for how consciousness could arise. And I think the difficulty there is that consciousness, as I've mentioned, it just seems to be fundamentally non-physical in nature. It's a completely different category from rearranging molecules. No matter how complex you make a brain, that's not going to turn it into a conscious thinking being. And same thing with computers. We have these science fiction movies like I, Robot or the Terminator films, which the whole premise is one day, once computers are complex enough, they'll eventually become aware and have consciousness, right? And then go and try to eliminate humanity. But I see no reason to fear that idea, because to get consciousness from matter alone is like getting something from nothing. Those who try to argue for this idea, they'll often talk about consciousness being an emergent property, and they compare it to, say, the fluidness of liquids like water. And they say, from just looking at hydrogen and oxygen and H2O molecules, you wouldn't necessarily realize that water would feel wet. But actually, in principle, that isn't so hard to understand. You can sort of tell that the way molecules slip past one another, that's what makes water feel wet. And so it does arise from a certain arrangement of the molecules. But consciousness has so many features that just defy any type of material explanation. And so, no, I don't think that it could arise from increasingly complex arrangements of matter alone.
You were talking about how consciousness is more than just being physical. Is there evidence that people have souls?
Oh, yes. Well, I would say it's not only our thinking that's not physical, but our conscious experience also has to be grounded in what philosophers call an immaterial substance. And by that, they mean a soul. And there are further arguments that would support the existence of the soul. Again, if you're a Bible-believing Christian, then Jesus is the authority, the Bible is the authority, and they tell us that humans have souls. But people actually from cultures around the world throughout history, that's been the default view, that people have tended to believe that we are bodies and souls. It's only in recent years where naturalistic worldview has become more dominant in the Western world that people are now skeptical of this idea. But the reason people have believed that is because it's kind of a natural conclusion from our awareness that we are not reducible to our bodies. You know, we have a will, for example, and we can differentiate between things that we will to do, like say raise my arm intentionally, versus if there were a scientist with maybe an electrical probe who stimulates my arm and forces it to rise, I recognize that that wasn't me. That was the scientist who did that. But why should we differentiate between those two things if all we are is our physical bodies? According to a naturalistic outlook, even when I will to raise my arm, that's really just the right atoms happening in my brain that causes nerve impulses and muscles contracting and so forth. it's really not fundamentally different from other forces acting from outside to force my arm to move. But we know that our reflexes and things like eyes blinking, we can do it intentionally, or it can just be a reflex. And it's us causing those intentional movements. One other argument would be the very fact that I remain myself over time as parts of my body get replaced. I understand scientists tell us something like every 7 years, all the atoms in our bodies get replaced by new ones. So as physical objects change over time, especially if they're replaced entirely, they would technically not be the same object that they were before. So how do I still remain me over the years? And think about when I was 5 years old, my body looked radically different than it does now, right? Why am I still me today? The best explanation seems to be that I'm not merely my physical body, but there's an immaterial part of me that grounds my identity over